My husband of 38 years passed on a Sunday afternoon in late October. By Wednesday, my daughter-in-law had already called a real estate agent. She didn't tell me. She told my son. And my son told me 3 days later the way people deliver news they know is wrong but have already agreed to anyway, quickly, with his eyes on the floor, framed as something she had done just to get a sense of things, just to get a sense. My husband wasn't even in the ground yet, and she was getting a sense of things. My name is Josephine. I'm 67 years old. I spent 29 years as a licensed pharmacist in a mid-sized hospital in Greenville, South Carolina. People who have never worked in a hospital imagine it as a place of doctors and drama. What it actually is a place of waiting and watching and learning to read what people aren't saying out loud. You spend enough years watching families in waiting rooms, and you develop a very particular kind of patience. You learn that the ones who are loudest about their concern are rarely the ones most concerned. You learn that the smile someone puts on when they walk through a door tells you almost everything about what they've already decided before they got there. My daughter-in-law has a very good smile. Her name is Brenly. She married my son Owen 4 years ago in a ceremony at a restored antebellum inn outside of Charleston that cost more than I make in 4 months of pension. I contributed. I didn't keep a record of how much because my husband Gordon had spent our whole marriage teaching me that the accounting of generosity poisons it. I believed him. I still do. What I don't believe anymore is that the people on the receiving end always feel the same way. Gordon died of a heart attack. Massive, the cardiologist said, the kind that moves fast, which I was told was a mercy. And I have spent 13 months deciding whether I believe that, or whether it's just the thing you tell people, because the truth, that someone you loved was here and then was not, is too blunt to hand to someone who is already falling. He was 69. He had been talking about retiring fully since spring. He had a woodworking project half finished in the garage, a rocking chair he was building for our back porch, and every time I walk past it I have to choose whether to look at it or not. Owen drove down from Charlotte the day Gordon died. He stayed for the funeral and for 10 days after that, and then he went home because that is what people do, and I would not have wanted it any other way. My daughter, my younger one, she lives in Tucson with her husband and 2 boys. She called every morning for weeks. She sent me a book about grief that I haven't opened, but appreciate having. She sent flowers twice. She did everything right from 1,700 miles away, which is its own kind of love, and I have never once doubted it. Owen was 90 minutes away, and Brenny made sure that 90 minutes felt like something that could be crossed or closed, depending on what was useful for her at the time. It started the way these things always start, gently, reasonably, with the specific language of people who have decided something and are now in the process of making you feel like you decided it yourself. In November, over the phone, she mentioned that our house, a 4-bedroom craftsman I'd lived in for 21 years, the one Gordon and I had paid off entirely in 2018, was a lot to manage for one person. She said it warmly, the way you say something you want to sound like concern and not like inventory. I said I was managing fine. She said of course I was. The subject changed. In December, at Christmas dinner at their house, she mentioned a friend whose mother had transitioned beautifully into an active senior community outside of Fort Mill. She showed me photos. Lovely grounds, she said, a pool, a garden program, activities. She said it the way a person describes something they've already toured, which I later found out she had. In January, my son called. The call had the cadence of something that had been rehearsed, not by him originally, but that he'd agreed to deliver. He said he'd been thinking, and you could hear that word, thinking, doing heavy lifting for what had actually been someone else's idea. about whether I'd considered longer-term options, whether I had a plan for the house, whether I'd thought about liquidity. I was 6 months out from losing my husband. I was walking 2 miles every morning along the river path near our neighborhood. I was cooking my own meals and keeping my own calendar and showing up to my book club and doing all the things that people do when they are living their lives. I was not struggling with the liquidity. I knew exactly what he was being sent to ask, and I knew exactly who had sent him. Here is what they didn't know. Gordon was a methodical man. He was an engineer by training and a planner by nature. He did not like loose ends. 3 years before he died, after a colleague went through a brutal dispute with his children over an estate that had no structure to it, Gordon had sat down with our attorney, a woman named Frances, who has handled our legal matters for 15 years and who I trust completely, and he had restructured everything. The house, which we owned outright, had been transferred into a revocable living trust. Our investment accounts, the ones Gordon had been contributing to since his 30s, were titled the same way. He had also established a separate LLC for a small rental property we owned on the other side of town, the kind of thing we had never mentioned to anyone because Gordon believed that your financial structure was nobody's business until it needed to be. He used to say that the quietest rooms are the safest ones. I had not thought much about any of this during the fog of those first months. Grief does not leave a lot of room for strategic thinking. But sometime in January, after Owen's phone call, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table late at night with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, and I started paying attention the way I hadn't let myself since Gordon died. I started adding things up. The real estate agent call on Wednesday, the senior community photos in December, the rehearsed conversation about liquidity in January, and underneath all of it, something I hadn't wanted to name, because naming it would mean it was real. I called Frances in the first week of February, not because I was in crisis, but because I had learned over 29 years of pharmacy work that you don't wait until you're in crisis to prepare for one. Frances and I talked for almost an hour. She confirmed everything was as Gordon had set it up. The house in the trust, the investment accounts in the trust, the rental property in the LLC, none of it was titled in my name individually, which meant that anyone looking at a simple asset search would see far less than they expected. Frances also explained something to me that I filed away carefully, that in South Carolina, initiating any kind of guardianship or conservatorship proceeding, the legal process by which a court can appoint someone to manage another person's finances if they're deemed incapable, requires a full accounting of the person's assets, and assets held in trusts and LLCs are a significantly more complex matter to touch than assets held outright. The court doesn't just hand them over. There are layers. There are questions. There are things that take time and scrutiny that people pursuing easy outcomes generally don't want to deal with. I thanked Frances and I went back to my life. I took a watercolor class at the art center on Tuesday evenings. I drove to Tucson in late February to see my daughter and my grandsons for 10 days. I let my grandson teach me how to play chess badly, and I sat on her back porch and we talked in the evenings the way we hadn't since before. Everything changed. I drove home feeling, for the first time, something close to like myself again. March came. 5 months since Gordon. The anniversary of anything is its own kind of weight, and I carried it quietly. I planted the window boxes on the front porch that we always planted in March. Snapdragons, the way we always did, because Gordon liked them, and I thought about him the way you think about someone when they're folded into everything around you. The call from Owen came on a Thursday evening. He said he and Brenly wanted me to come to dinner on Saturday. He said there was something they wanted to talk through together. His voice had the quality of someone who knows what's coming and has already decided they're going to go through with it anyway. I said I'd be there. I noticed the car I didn't recognize when I pulled into their driveway. Dark blue sedan, no one's car that I knew. I noticed it the way I used to notice something out of place in a medication order, not with alarm, just with attention. The kind of attention that doesn't announce itself. Brenly answered the door. She had the smile in place, the full one. She hugged me. She said dinner smelled wonderful, and she'd been looking forward to this. Owen stood a few feet behind her. He looked like a man who had agreed to something and was now living inside the agreement. In the living room there was a man I didn't know. Late 40s, well-dressed in the careful way of people who spend a lot of time in professional settings where first impressions are doing work. He stood when I came in. He introduced himself as Mr. Calloway. He was an attorney. He had a leather folio on the coffee table that he'd been sitting in front of when I walked in. Brenly explained with her hands folded and that smile at the same controlled intensity that she and Owen had been so worried about making sure I was taken care of, that they loved me and wanted me to have security and peace of mind, that they'd brought Mr. Calloway in because they wanted to make sure there was a plan in place. She used the word plan 4 times in about 90 seconds. She was very good at it. Mr. Calloway had prepared some documents, he said, in the patient tone of a man who does uncomfortable things for a living and has learned to do them gently. A financial power of attorney that would name Owen as my agent. A healthcare directive. And, he said, pausing just a moment in the way that told me this was the real point of the meeting, a voluntary conservatorship arrangement which would allow Owen to manage my estate while I continued to live my life with what Mr. Calloway called full independence. Full independence. I noted the phrase. I looked at Brenly. She was still smiling. It was the same smile she'd had when she called the real estate agent 4 days after Gordon died. I looked at my son. He was looking at a point somewhere between me and the window. He had the expression of a man who has been slowly walked away from his own instincts until he can no longer clearly see where he started. I turned to Mr. Calloway. What assets, I said, would the conservatorship cover? He named them. The house. Any investment or brokerage accounts. Any real property. I nodded. I let a moment pass. Outside a car went by. The ice maker in their kitchen clicked and hummed. Our house, I said, is held in a revocable living trust that my husband established 3 years ago. It is not titled in my name. Our investment accounts are held in the same trust. We also have a rental property held in an LLC. I paused. I spoke with our attorney about all of this in February. Everything is documented and in order. Is there a specific asset you'd like to discuss? The room got very quiet. Mr. Rhea, Calloway looked down at his folio. Then he looked up at Brenly. Brenly's smile stopped working. Not all at once, but in stages, like something trying to hold its shape and losing the ability to. Surprise first, then something that looked like rapid calculation, then a kind of stillness that I recognized from years of watching people absorb information they had not prepared for. Owen was looking at me, really looking at me, for what felt like the first time in months. "Mum," he said. "We didn't, I know," I said. I kept my voice level because I had decided well before that evening that I would not give the moment more weight than it needed. I had decided I would not cry, and I would not raise my voice, and I would not say anything I hadn't already considered. I had had months to consider. "I know you didn't fully understand what was being proposed," I said. "I hope you'll think about that." I stood. I picked up my purse. I thanked Mr. Calloway because none of what had happened was his fault. He had been hired to do a job and he had done it correctly. I told Brenly that everything smelled wonderful, but I thought I would head home. I kissed Owen on the cheek, and he grabbed my hand, briefly, tightly, the way he used to when he was small and had done something he knew was wrong and didn't yet have the words for it. I drove home. I made tea. I sat in Gordon's chair by the front window, the one that looks out over the street, and the oak tree that loses its leaves last every fall, and I sat there for a long time and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter and more solid than that. What came after came slowly. Real things do. Owen called the next morning. Early. He was calling from his car, I found out later, parked down the block from their house before Brenny was awake. He talked for a long time. He told me things I had suspected, and some I hadn't. He told me about how it had been framed to him over months. The concerns, the research, the gentle repositioning of every conversation, until the conclusion felt like something he'd arrived at himself. He said he was ashamed, not embarrassed, not sorry, but ashamed, which is a different thing, a heavier one, and I let it sit between us before I reached for it. I told him I wasn't angry at him. That was true. What I was sad, and something more complicated than sad. Something like the particular grief of watching someone you raised make a choice you know they knew better than. I told him that loving his wife and being loyal to me were not supposed to be competing things, that somewhere along the way he had been convinced they were, and that was the thing worth sitting with. He came to the house the following Thursday. Just him. We sat at the kitchen table, the one he'd sat at every morning for 18 years, and we drank coffee until it was cold. He asked me why I hadn't said anything sooner. All those months of watching it unfold, why hadn't I fought back harder? I thought about how to answer that honestly. If I had confronted Brenly, I said, it would have become a war between your wife and your mother. You would have had to choose a side, and you would have chosen hers, not because she was right, but because that's what people do when they're in the middle of something like that, and because she is very good at telling a story. I wrapped my hands around the mug. This way you got to see it clearly, on your own. That's the only way it means something. He was quiet for a while. Then he asked when I had talked to Francis. When I told him February, 4 months before the dinner, he put his hands over his face and stayed there for a moment. Your father set everything up? I said. I just made a phone call. He did the real work. Years ago, when none of this was necessary yet, because that's the kind of man he was. Owen looked up. He knew, he said. It wasn't quite a question. He was prepared, I said. That's different from knowing. He just didn't want to leave me without a structure. There was one more thing I needed to do, and I waited until the following week to do it. I drove to Owen and Brenly's house on a Tuesday afternoon, when I knew Owen was at work. I rang the bell and waited. She took a moment to answer. When she did, she looked at me the way someone looks when they're trying to determine what version of a conversation is about to happen. The smile came, slower this time, and with less certainty behind it. I asked if I could come in. She stepped back. We sat at her kitchen table. She offered coffee. I said no thank you. I had thought carefully about what I wanted to say for several days. I had written it out twice and thrown both versions away because they were too long and too organized. And what I wanted to say was actually simple. I told her that I understood fear, that I had spent enough years watching people in hard situations to know that fear is what drives most of the things people do that they later find hard to explain. Fear that there isn't enough. Fear that there isn't enough. Fear that security has to be grabbed instead of built. Fear that if you don't act, someone else will, or no one will, and things will slip away. I didn't know her history well enough to know where her particular fear had come from, but I believed it was real. I also told her, plainly and without performance, that what she had done was serious, that hiring an attorney to initiate a process designed to remove my control over my own life and assets while smiling at me across a dinner table for months was not something I would forget quickly or pretend hadn't happened. That trust between people is not rebuilt by skipping the injury, that it would take time and honesty and real effort, and that I was not going to pretend otherwise to keep the peace. She sat very still while I talked. She didn't apologize. When I finished, she said she would think about what I'd said. I told her that was fine. On my way to the door, I said that I hoped we would find our way to something real, that I meant it, that she was my son's wife and the possibility of my grandchildren, and I would always rather have something genuine between us than something performed for everyone else's comfort. Then I went home. Spring finished arriving the way it does in the Carolinas, all at once, and with a kind of certainty that makes you forget winter was ever real. The azaleas came up the way they always do, and the pollen coated everything for 3 weeks, and the mornings started feeling like something to walk into rather than just get through. I finished the watercolor class and signed up for a second session. I finally learned to make Gordon's mother's pound cake the way he used to describe it, from a recipe I found in his handwriting on a folded piece of paper inside a cookbook we'd had for 40 years. I sat on the back porch in the evenings and listened to the neighborhood. Owen called every Sunday. He called because he called, not because he'd been reminded, and the difference was audible. We talked about things we hadn't talked about in a long time, about his father, about what Gordon had been like when Owen was young, the stories I'd been holding on to that there had never seemed to be the right time for. Those conversations surprised me. I hadn't expected them, and I didn't take them for granted. In April, a card came in the mail, Brenly's handwriting on the envelope. Inside, a few sentences. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been talking to someone, a therapist she meant, and that she was trying to understand some things about herself. She said she hoped we could begin again, even if it was slowly. I put the card on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where I see it when I'm washing dishes, not as a record of what happened, as a reminder that people are capable of surprising you in both directions. I found Gordon's woodworking notes on the workbench in the garage on a Saturday in May. Measurements, sketches, the dimensions of the rocking chair, everything labelled in his particular handwriting that always looked more like drafting than writing. I stood there for a long time. Then I found a YouTube tutorial on woodworking for beginners. I don't know if I'll ever actually finish the chair, but I think Gordon would have found the attempt completely unreasonable, which means he would have loved it. Life without him is not what I expected and not what I feared, which I think might be the only accurate thing I can say about it. It is harder in some ways I anticipated and easier in ways I didn't. It is quieter. It is. Some mornings when the light comes in through the east-facing kitchen window and the coffee is right, and the neighborhood is just beginning to make its sounds, entirely and peacefully mine. I'm 67 years old. I spent 29 years watching people navigate the worst moments of their lives, with grace or without it, and I learn more from that than from anything else. I lost a man I loved for 38 years, and I survived that, which still surprises me some days. I watched a plan built quietly to take away my independence dissolve in one still moment, not because I fought loudly, but because a man who loved me had spent years building something designed to hold. I write in my journal in the mornings. I always have, at the kitchen table with the first cup of coffee, before the day has opinions about anything. The last thing I wrote that felt worth keeping was short. I wrote, "The chair isn't finished, neither am I." And that's exactly right. The snapdragons came back this year. That's enough. Gordon used to say that the quietest rooms are the safest ones. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I was sitting in my son's living room, watching an attorney open a leather folio and feeling the entire shape of a plan that had been months in the making finally make itself visible. And I was ready, not because I had fought or argued or warned anyone, but because Gordon had spent years building something quietly, and I had spent months paying attention. That combination, his foresight and my patience, was what held. I think about cause and effect a lot more than I used to. Not in a fatalistic way, but in the practical way of someone who has watched enough situations unfold to know that what happens at the end of a story is almost never a surprise if you watch the beginning carefully enough. Brenly didn't arrive at that dinner table with an attorney because she was a bad person who woke up one morning and decided to cause harm. She arrived there because fear had been building in her for a long time, and she had never learned to sit with it. Fear that there wasn't enough. Fear that security was something you had to seize rather than something you could build honestly over time. People who act from that kind of fear rarely see themselves clearly. They see a problem and a solution, and they move toward the solution, and they don't stop to examine whether the method reveals something about their character. That's not an excuse. It's just how it tends to work. What I know about integrity, about doing the right thing even when the easier thing is available, is that it compounds over time the same way dishonesty does. Gordon spent years building a structure designed to protect the life we had made together. He did it without telling anyone, without seeking credit, without using it as a bargaining chip. He did it because he loved me, and because he was the kind of man who thought about consequences before they arrived. That's what I mean when I say I'm still learning from him even now, 13 months after I lost him. And I had to bring my own part to it. The months of watching without reacting, the decision to call Francis in February, not because I was certain something was wrong, but because I had learned across 29 years in a hospital that preparation is not paranoia. It is respect for yourself and for the people who are counting on you. That took a kind of mental discipline I didn't know I had until I needed it. The discipline to stay calm when someone is slowly trying to rearrange your life. To not tip your hand, to trust what you know and wait for the moment when knowing it actually matters. Strength doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like a 67-year-old woman sitting quietly at a dinner table, saying 3 sentences in an even voice, and then picking up her purse and going home to make tea. Owen told me later that it was the calmness that undid him more than anything. Not anger, not accusation, just clarity. I think that's the thing worth passing on, not the legal structure, though if this story makes even one person call an estate attorney, that's a good outcome. But the other part, the part about knowing who you are, clearly enough that no one else can define it for you, the part about having enough respect for yourself to prepare, to pay attention, and to trust that quiet strength, applied at the right moment, holds more weight than any amount of noise. The rocking chair is still unfinished in the garage. I looked up a woodworking class at the community centre last week. I haven't signed up yet, but I'm thinking about it. Gordon would tell me to stop thinking and just go.